Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. For today's episode, we were lucky enough to speak with Jon Ogden, who's one of the founders of Uplift Kids, which is a program that integrates both ancient wisdom and modern science to help parents build values in their home. We'll explain more about Uplift once the conversation starts, but we really think it's a fascinating and important effort. In two of the most popular episodes that we've ever released, number 85 and 86, Michael Wilcox joined us to talk about God's many voices, how God is communicated through many different people all throughout time and space. And one of the things that we loved most about Uplift is that it pulls in so many of those voices in a way that's really digestible for both kids and adults. To give you just a little bit more about Jon, he earned an undergraduate degree in literature and a master's in writing with an emphasis on research and ethics. And Jon has worked as a university instructor, instructional designer, and a writer. He's coupled that work with a decades-long study of the world's wisdom traditions. He co-created Uplift Kids along with Amanda Suarez, Drew Hansen, and Michelle Larson. Thanks so much as always for listening. We really hope that you enjoy this conversation with Jon Ogden. All right, Jon Ogden, we're so excited to have you in the studio. Thank you so much for making some time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
Tim and I our whole family, we're huge fans of Uplift, and we've been wanting to talk about this for a long time. So this is gonna be really fun. Our listeners will have heard about you and a little bit about the project, but I wonder if you could just tell us more about who this project was intended for and kind of how it came to be.
Sure. Uplift is intended for parents who have gone through a faith shift or a faith expansion, and they're looking for a way to teach their kid values. And so there could be values such as kindness, compassion, forgiveness, in addition to emotional intelligence and emotional health, and then timeless wisdom practices such as meditation and expressing gratitude and those kind of things. And so Uplift came about because a group of us participated in something from Lower Light School of Wisdom, which Thomas McConkie runs. We participated in this 9-month course called Spectra. And over the course of the course, we started asking this question of, what about kids? So there are groups that exist to help grown-ups with spirituality, spiritual development, both inside and outside of religion. And yet, as far as we could see, there aren't many that help with kids. And so we started asking, what would it look like to create something that can help families who want some way to teach their kids values and spirituality, but might be wrestling with some faith issues. And out of that grew Uplift.
That's awesome. So it's really so cool.
Yeah.
We've been doing it with our kids, and it just feels like the types of conversations that Aubrey and I have had, we've been wanting to loop our kids in with them, and it's been hard until we've been able to use this curriculum that you guys have put together, and it's just been so useful.
Maybe we should frame like kind of what a lesson looks like. So for someone who hasn't got on or seen the website, so you have I was going to say a handful, but they're actually, I mean, how many lessons now? You've got to have
nearly 80.
Okay, I was going to say close to 100.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're short little lessons that are, what I love about it is that you have multiple ideas for different developmental stages. So there's curriculum for little kids and big kids, and then there's always something for adults at the beginning that you can kind of do your homework before you start a lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, there's just such a solid list of resources. And then this lesson can kind of turn into just like a quick, like we use it for family home evening. And it's just like a quick little lesson, as long as you want it to be the kind of like can guide a discussion. And I should be letting you explain maybe what it is, but that's
great.
But that's kind of what Uplift is. It's just like a collection of like values-based lessons that pulls in science and wisdom traditions from around the world and kind of distills it into something that is so digestible for our 4-year-old and also like useful for us and for our 13-year-old. Like it just feels like such an awesome way to have really, really like productive conversations as a family around values that are super important that I don't feel like an expert in, and it just feels like a way to make it teachable without being an expert. Like you don't have to be an expert in all of these wisdom traditions to actually like use them. So that, anyway, I want to just plug that in. Like this is what we're talking about.
And so I guess the question that I was going to get to is that one of the sort of foundational principles that you talk about throughout the curriculum is finding one's inner compass, both parents and children. that's something that maybe I feel like, at least when I was growing up, I didn't necessarily, I was more focused on external compasses, you know? And so I'm finding it really valuable for me, but also like finding words to teach my kids about that. So I'm curious, sort of two questions, like what is the reason for the focus on the inner compass that you guys have? And it just culturally, you know, in religions generally, in the Latter-day Saint tradition, in you know, political culture, like what are some of the impediments that you see to people developing an inner compass?
Noise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Life is really noisy, and it's also frenetic, and it's pacing. And so just seeking stillness and times for contemplation, and then also just opening up to something greater than ourselves. We can kind of get caught up in our task lists, and being able to ask the question, is this really what my life is about? Is this really what my life should be about? And just being honest with the answer to that question, I think, can really help us find and align ourselves to our inner compass. Because life is so busy, we often don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Just one thing after another. And we might be barreling down a path that we actually shouldn't be barreling down. And so by coming to stillness, we can kind of tune back in, you know, and try to hear the still small voice.
Yeah.
So more traditional metaphor.
Yeah. I'm curious about that a little bit. Obviously, from a Latter-day Saint perspective, inner compass and, like you say, still small voice may be totally synonymous. But I'm curious for somebody that's sort of dived deep, you know, creating this curriculum on different wisdom and faith traditions around the world. Like, what is the inner compass more like? Is it traditionally more focused on like the self and like getting somehow into your own heart, or is it explicitly, from most traditions' perspective, a connection to the divine in some way?
I think we picked up that term by a book that we all read called The Spiritual Child, and it's by a professor of psychology at Columbia University, and her name is Lisa Miller.
Yes.
It's a fantastic book. I recommend it to anybody who's interested in this topic. She talks about inner compass, and she comes from a Jewish background. And so I don't know exactly how that metaphor is used in every instance, but I do think that, well, I should say, in the way that she uses it, she does talk about a connection to the divine. And so I think it fits well with that. If somebody is a complete non-believer and they don't believe in external divine, I still think the metaphor works very well. Like just tuning into their inner sense of like their conscience, their inner knowing, their heart knowing is another term that Lisa Miller uses. And I think that you can use that metaphor regardless of what your specific belief is. And so that's why we chose inner compass, is because of its flexibility and its expansiveness. But certainly it can fit very well with an idea of inner compass being aligned with God, being aligned with the divine, whatever it might be, you know, whatever language one might use. There's a power in practices that help you align with your inner compass.
Yeah. And I love how in the lessons there you really facilitate moments for reflection like that, or meditation. A lot of the lessons have a still moment where you all are going to contemplate a question or just be still and quiet, and not necessarily like have a discussion for a minute, which does not come naturally to me. So I really like that it kind of paces you. And I don't remember if it was in the inner compass lesson. I think it might have been, but there was a prompt where I think the goal was to sort of brainstorm, like when you have these, the term I'm remembering is temporary blissful centerings, which we named as feeling the spirit, you know, and
so good.
And yeah, and it was so interesting. Like I remember 11-year-old, he goes, I don't feel the spirit at church. I feel the spirit when I'm totally alone in my room. And I know that about him, you know, but I had never put language to it. I think I had always recognized that he's sort of an introvert, and like he doesn't want to be in a crowded space ever. Like that is really draining for him. And it was so amazing to like have this moment where I realized like it's not just that that's his preference, like his soul needs that. And I was so happy that like at 11 he could put words to that and realize that like for his own connection to God, he needs to be alone, and I need to go to church and be with people, my neighbors. Like that's just that is how I connect. But it's different for him, and it was like it was just one of those. It was a really like a special moment. Like I felt like I could see him, you know, in a real way that I hadn't really seen him before, and it felt really important for me to understand him that way, as you know, as his mom. So I was grateful for that lesson. Like that felt like such a really good starting place for all of the Uplift lessons. And you have so that's in this section called Foundations. There are 7 lessons that are foundational, and Inner Compass is number 1. But I wonder if we could just go through a couple more of these, because I thought it was such an interesting list, and I would have loved to be in the room where you were deciding which things made it into Foundations and which made it into another list of values. So Lineage is another one that comes up as a foundation, and I loved that one. I think that's something we really value in our culture. But could you just talk about why you felt like that was such an important foundational value?
Yeah. I'll first say that I was really touched by the story that you shared. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was really important for our family, I think.
Lineage excites me now more than ever, which is surprising to me. Like I just feel more and more desire to know my family history and to know all the stories that I can find, and even go beyond my Mormon heritage and know their stories too. And part of it comes because I've read a series of studies that talk about how it's good for your children's well-being to know where they come from. And so one study in particular, they asked like these, I would say it's about 20 questions to kids, and they asked stories about their family history. And they found that the kids who knew the answers to their questions had higher well-being. Wow. And so it's just like, from a purely logical viewpoint, I want my kids to know these stories. And there's also something that is spiritually powerful about connection to the past. And I feel like often in secular culture, we're so fixated on the now, in, again, that day-to-day busy kind of way, that we don't really connect deeply through our roots. There's kind of a dismissiveness in a secular mindset that can be like, oh, those ancient fools from the past, they didn't know anything, right. But now we're so enlightened, we know everything, right? And so it's kind of like an integrating. It's like, oh, there's wisdom from the past, and there's wisdom from my family history, and there are things that I can learn from my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and so on. And so it's really important for me to know their stories. One quote that you put here was from Elaine Reese, and we have this on our site. It says that adolescents with a stronger knowledge of family history have more robust identities, better coping skills, and lower rates of depression and anxiety. So that's actually a different researcher than the other one that I cited. So it's like, it's been verified multiple times that this is really good. And so it's a key part of Uplift, because no matter who you are, you come from somewhere, and you already have these stories if you dig for them, right? And so you could come from any tradition, any religious tradition or non-tradition. And the consistent thing is you have family stories. Yeah. And so there's power in this unifying approach to spirituality. And it's interesting paradox, because every single family has totally different stories. And so in some sense, you're completely isolated, right, in your stories. And yet you all have the stories in common. And so there's a lot of power in just owning those stories and really treasuring those stories as a family.
Love that.
I love that too, because I think, when we have family history lessons in church, I think, at least the way I hear it a lot of times, is like, I feel a lot of guilt. Like they need me and I need to do these things. And that's my connection to the past. And I really liked that. I feel like it sort of sanitized that message in a way that feels really good to me, that I need them. And like having that connection is good for is good for my family. Like I could feel like that message feels really powerful. And something we started doing after we talked about this is on the birthdays of our, so I think I felt more connected with ancestors, generations back. We talked about 6 generations back and handcart pioneers, and that is a strength that I'm familiar with and I really value. But I feel like we've really started to emphasize a connection to a more recent past, and just a single generation even ahead that has passed away. And we've started celebrating their birthdays with something very small that like reminds us of that person. And I've been really surprised how present that makes them feel in our family still. Like I really love that it feels something unique to our family and special. Like it really created a feeling of connection out of nothing, like out of nowhere. It just suddenly there was like real connection there. So
and it does seem to me like at the same time that this is something that you could celebrate in the Latter-day Saint tradition. That this is it's potentially something we do really well. Just the fact that we're talking about it, maybe more than anybody else. I mean, you've got Family Search and Ancestry that, I mean, obviously Ancestry is a corporation, but it sort of like came out of the tradition. It's like worldwide people are flocking to these tools to help because they're feeling, I think, the same thing, which is like a desire to connect to their family, to their family stories.
Yeah.
So it's something really, potentially that we've done that's really cool.
Yeah, that's so true. I want to go through like literally all of them. We probably don't have time, but will you talk about polarities? Because that felt like kind of a new one to me that I think about often now.
This is another one of the foundations.
This is another one of the 7 foundations.
Yeah, this one excites me very much as well. It's the idea that, as we talk about it, any virtue held too tightly becomes a vice. So if you hold, let's see, courage too tightly, this is something that actually Aristotle wrote about in his works on ethics. Courage held too tightly becomes recklessness, and that can lead to negative consequences in your life. But the opposite is caution, and caution held too tightly leads to paralysis. And so polarities are about holding 2 poles together so that you can recognize that it's not enough just to learn one virtue in isolation and kind of like grip to that really tightly, because you can delude yourself. You're thinking, well, I'm cautious. I'm just cautious, and it's like, yes, and that caution is causing you paralysis in your life, such that you're not actually risking anything and you're not actually growing, right? And so this idea is that if you can know these various polarities, you can ask yourself, how am I holding this virtue? Am I too in love with it? Like, am I too comfortable with it such that I'm actually preventing my growth by holding it so tightly? And I go out and I say, like, look how cautious I am again. It's like, okay, yeah, good. And you recognize that there's actually value in listening to the opposite pole. And if you can really listen to the opposite pole and hear the interchange, then you can transcend and include. Now, this is a practice that we did quite a bit in Lower Lights, and Thomas does quite a bit, integral polarity practice. And so it's about listening to the different parts of yourself. And so courage shows up as a voice. Caution shows up as a voice in you. They're in all of us. And we can listen to the voice of caution, and we can listen to the voice of courage, and we can see what gifts they bring to the self. And then we can learn to have them dialogue and live in harmony with various polarities. So sometimes the language is a bit esoteric and strange. Polarity is kind of a strange word, but there's so much power in it because it can really bring a sense of humility to life, to keep yourself in check, and to kind of realize, like, oh, I've been thinking that I'm really good in all these ways, but I haven't actually been listening carefully enough to the opposite pole. And I would actually have more virtue in my life if I listened to both poles together.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Are there certain polarities that you feel like show up very commonly? So again, since this is sort of a Latter-day Saint focused podcast, that you feel like show up in the tradition, really as potential vices. Like, One that occurs to me potentially could be obedience. Like, do we hold too tightly to obedience sometimes? And if we do, what's the vice that grows out of that?
The device is that you eclipse your inner compass. That's two different metaphors that I'm mixing there. You like
we got you.
yeah, you actually stifle the still small voice.
Yeah.
By saying like, okay, you might have the intonations of the Spirit speaking to you, and you stifle it because you say, no, I'm supposed to listen to my logical self, which says I need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And you ultimately end up not listening to the Spirit, which isn't to say that the Spirit would say something that is like the opposite of goodness. Certainly, that's not to say that at all. But you just might say, the way it looks for you is this.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, no, it can't look like that.
Right.
And rules that have been laid out in advance just can't cover every scenario individuality.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is why we lead with inner compass, because it's like, here are all these values and virtues, and here are different ways to look at the values and virtues, like via polarities. And another one of our foundations is strengths. You might have your particular set of strengths in your life that make you unique. And after going through all of these things, if your inner compass says no, listen to your inner compass.
Yeah.
Right. That's the ground of all being, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why we lead with that one.
Yeah, totally. This is something. Sense. This whole idea of polarities, I think, shows up very often in one's own talents. Right. It's like for me in particular, as somebody that has we have talked about this on the podcast, but suffers from OCD. It's like my sort of perfectionistic tendencies have led to a lot of good in my life, but taken overboard, which they have been for significant periods, it turns into scrupulosity, which it has negative effects not only on you but on everyone around you. And so it's just so true. I think it really resonates.
This came up this week. Actually, I used the conflict lesson in Come Follow Me. The story was about Abraham and Lot and how they divide the land, and Abraham says, you take one side and I'll take the other. And so I was like, I want to talk about conflict because I would have heard this lesson as a kid, and what I would have absorbed is that being a peacemaker is always the right answer. Like that was the polarity I was most in love with, and really held on to that so tight. And what you talk about in the conflict lesson is that we have all these options and tendencies toward maybe we fight or we flee or we freeze. And I was a freezer, and so I could hear that Abraham story and say, what freezing looks like is Abraham saying, Lot, take all the land. Like, I can see you want the land. Like, take the land, and I don't need anything. And it was really helpful to have this framework of polarity and say, like, I can be a peacemaker and face this conflict in a really healthy way and say, like, I have a need and you have a need, and like, let's compromise. And that is that's what a peacemaker can mean to me now. It doesn't mean being a doormat. And that was, I think, just having this idea always in the back of your mind that you're looking for polarities kind of keeps you out of that danger zone of becoming like so entrenched in one value that it actually becomes detrimental. So came up again this week.
Yeah.
Great example.
Still hard. Still hard, but like that, but it's so useful. It's just so useful to like have these tools kind of, because it comes up every day. Like every day you have opportunities to kind of see how this is playing out in your regular life.
Yeah.
Let's talk really briefly maybe about something that people might see as a polarity, I guess, to reuse that term in a different way. You guys talk about how you integrate the best of science and ancient wisdom. I think at a very surface level, it could appear, at least to somebody that's coming at it from one side or the other, those two could be in conflict. Especially if you sort of put ancient wisdom and religious faith in sort of the same box. Like there's this age-old perceived conflict at the very least between those two things. So how do you guys approach that?
It's a big question and a hard one to answer. One example that I look toward is Martin Luther King Jr. And when he was in college, he had a faith crisis. And he kind of initially was very rattled by it. And he talks about that the things that he'd learned in Sunday school didn't quite align with his then worldview. And then he also talks about how he came to see the power that was in the Bible, and like I'll use the words poetic power. I can't remember the exact phrases that he uses right now. He became a minister even after his faith crisis. And you can see the religious language all throughout his sermons and his speeches. And so he took on the role within his own tradition and stayed within his own tradition. And yet his view didn't conflict with the scientific understanding of biblical events. And he writes about that. He did his PhD dissertation on things like this. And so he had a very nuanced view. And that's the kind of the approach that we take. Wisdom traditions arise in their particular cultural context, and science arose in a particular cultural context. And they both have value, and they both are valid. They're not always. What tends to happen is that people will want faith and religion to be valid in the same view, in the same playing field that science is in.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, but it's valid, but don't put it on that playing field.
Yes.
Because it's not meant to be on that playing field. And then the same with science can kind of sometimes want to play in the field of faith. And it's like, no, that's actually a different playing field.
Yeah.
And so as long as our approach is to say that they're both valid, but they use different lenses and they use different methods of being valid. And so that's how we hold them together. Yeah.
So those playing fields, are you getting at sort of like a head knowing and rationality versus heart knowing, or what are the playing fields?
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Okay. Is head knowing would be I can analyze it and put it to logical scrutiny. Is it logically consistent, and really approach it that way. And I can do tests in the material world on this thing over and over. And so it becomes an it out there that I can experiment on. Faith would be more internal at the level of like heart knowing. And it can also be intersubjective, where it's about goodness, where it's like, I feel hurt when this happens, and you say you feel hurt when that happens. Therefore, let's work together to a common good. So faith is more in the realm of I and we, and science is more in the realm of it.
Something I really love from your book, When Mormons Doubt, you kind of explore this idea even more, that you kind of go through this triad, that there's truth, there's beauty, and there's goodness. And when we emphasize one heavily over the other, we run into problems. So if you really emphasize truth, then you may find yourself being really cynical. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at cold hard facts as opposed to cold hard facts and what's beautiful. And on the other hand, if you're only looking for goodness and you're totally detached from the truth, and you may find yourself really misguided, or doing something that could actually also be detrimental. So can you talk about that balance? Like what is I think it's hard. I think maybe people get, and I know I've done this too, that I'll find myself sort of feeling pulled to one or the other, and it feels more comfortable to convince myself that one is more important than the others, because there's less tension there, like if I can decide on which one's most important, then I can feel really solid about all of my decisions. So can you just talk about finding balance there? I especially love, you really pull in all of these holy books from lots of wisdom traditions. And I appreciated that it was more important to just like look for the goodness and the beauty in those cases. And you weren't necessarily diving into the origin story of each holy book and like why it deserves to have attention. And so I could feel that like there was definitely some sort of balancing act going on, because in the same lesson, then you're pulling in psychology and something that is very like tangible and testable.
Yep.
So talk about just like the balance of that triad.
It's hard to find the right balance. It seems like any path that you go down, there's this sense that you want to just only rely on that. And so it's like, truth can become like the scientific inquiry becomes so powerful because you see it work over and over and again. It's like, oh, let's just rely on that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just so tired of not having ground that I just want to rely on that only. And then what can happen is that your life feels kind of empty. You start to sense this void where it's like, oh, if all there is material and I'm just material and that's it, like, what, you know, you start to get into this nihilistic viewpoint. And so people will say, well, I'm just going to turn to consumerism, and that's going to kind of like numb that pain I feel from the void. And it never quite succeeds at doing that. And so there's this longing that can occur where it's like, well, I'm looking for the transcendent and the divine, and something to connect me beyond myself. Whether it's God or nature, or it is to each other. And so it kind of goes back to listening to where you are on the journey and being honest, like, oh, I'm getting too fixated on truth claims, if that's the case. And my life is kind of miserable. And I could boast that I found out all the truth claims in the world, and it's not necessarily something that would make another person envious, because they're like, okay, well, you seem kind of miserable, but good job on that, right? It's like, okay. And to put the other side of the coin is like, just completely closing yourself off. Somebody comes to you and they say, hey, I've noticed that there are some really tense things for me in the history of the church, say. And to just say like, well, I don't want to talk about that because that's not what we're supposed to be talking about, right? It's like this nervousness that you just shut somebody down. Well, I can speak from firsthand experience. That is immensely painful to have encountered on the other side. And somebody who does that might think like they're doing it for a good cause, or because they want to be aligned with God, but they're inflicting harm in doing that.
Yeah. And there's so much fear there too. You know, personally, I think when that's the reaction, it's very fear-based, you know, so I think it's mutually harmful, right? Yeah. So what about beauty? Because what happens when you are feeling yourself, you know, set truth aside and set goodness aside, and you're just noticing like what's wonderful, like how can that be out of balance? Like, what does that look like when it is out of balance?
Beauty without truth can be gullible, and so this can happen in I'm trying to think of how to say it as kindly as possible. Like, it can happen in certain New Age circles, where people start believing in things that have been falsified already. They've been through the scientific process over and over and over, and people grab onto it still. And that can lead to falling for somebody who is a spiritual leader who ends up becoming very malicious and very destructive in their lives. And they can be led into it for thinking that they're finding beauty. And for right or wrong, I've dove into every story of cults that I can find.
It's like, so we share an obsession with cult documentaries, is what you're saying.
Yes. Okay. Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah. It's like, oh, there's a new one. Okay, here we go. Yeah. It's funny. Yeah.
But no, I mean, the interviews with these people that get involved, it does seem like there is this focus on beauty. It's just like everything is great. They're almost in a state of perpetual
and it is great.
Zen,
it is beautiful. Yeah. Like,
and it is for a while until it's not, you know, because of the absence of truth.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. So it can be incredibly destructive. But you look at every single one of these documentaries has a moment where they ask, so was it worth it? And they'll be like, it was so beautiful.
Yes. Yeah.
And I never felt more alive than when I started going there.
Yes.
And so that is like,
wow. That's such a, and it's the same problem. Yeah. That's just like what that problem looks like. That's so interesting.
Yeah, totally.
So when you talk about like being on a different playing field though, like that faith is on a different playing field than science, do you not mean that there's a different balance? Like, should truth hold as much weight as beauty and goodness when you're on the playing field of religion and faith?
I think it should. I will say that the word truth is sometimes slippery because people will say like I'm speaking my truth, and that's a valid thing to say. The way that I use it in this context is like scientific inquiry, which is kind of a limited view, and I acknowledge that. It's like, but I just want to footnote that.
That's helpful. Yeah.
To say like I'm using it in a certain way that I don't think is valid, and I don't think it's the only way to use the word.
Yeah.
But in this way of using the word, I do think that they should be equal. I think that people should be consulting their reason and logic. Like in the case of a cult documentary, or somebody gets wrapped up in a cult, if you say, hey, let's just take a break and go through these questions and just double check that it's logically consistent. Yeah. You can hopefully wake somebody up to the horrors that might come about later. Yeah. And so don't lose track of your rational mind.
Okay. Yeah. So what is the value then though of like myth and story? Because a lot of these holy books are not necessarily making any sort of like historicity truth claim. And so when you say truth, do you mean more like is the principle sound? Like if you do these things, we can scientifically say like you're gonna have more inner peace or joy, or is that the truth that you're anchoring to? Or do you know what I mean? Like how is story that's not meant to necessarily be historical still valuable?
There are many reasons why it's so valuable. One is that it reveals something about our psyche as human beings. So somebody could say, let's not pay attention to the story of Genesis because it makes the claim that the world was created in 6 days and therefore it's false, right? And they could write it off just saying, oh, it's a nonsense. That's a nonsense story because it doesn't fit our scientific model. And I think that would be a mistake because there's a reason why that story came about in the first place. Like there's some human being wanted to tell this story. And it's a story that survived. And so there's something to be said for that. Yeah. That's not to say that all stories that survive are good, because you could be like, it just survived because it was the story that the conqueror held, and therefore it has validity because the conqueror held it. And it's like, it's a little different. But I do think that there is something, if it has survived, then at least it deserves a look at. And so, like in the case of Genesis, there's like, I find it so compelling that there are stories of flawed human beings, and they kept them in their text for they went to such length to preserve these stories, and the protagonists aren't always without flaw. Like when I grew up and I listened to like the story of Esau and Jacob, I was like, okay, Esau's the bad guy and Jacob's the good guy, right? And it's kind of like reductive. Reduce everything to bad guy, good guy. Reading it now, it's like, wow, Jacob, like the whole story, the story never says like Jacob's the good guy, Esau's the bad guy. It says,
that's a good point.
Jacob, his brother was starving, and Jacob came to his brother in starvation and said, hey, I'm not going to give you any food unless you give me your birthright. It's like, okay, that's
questionable behavior.
Yeah, it's not necessarily generous. And then it says specifically, like Rebecca, overheard Isaac saying that he was going to give Isaiah the blessing, and she said, "Hey, Jacob, go and deceive your father to get the blessing." And so it's like lying right out to the father. And so there, I don't know. I just personally find that enthralling, I guess. I don't know what I would say. Like there's just the idea that they're really capturing the full breadth of humanity. These are very complex characters. We want to reduce them to good and bad because that's easier. But I think it's actually more spiritually powerful and spiritually nourishing to be thrust into a story where you actually you can't simplify it.
Right. Yeah,
What a good way to put it.
engaging in your own moral wrestle
Yeah,
with
exactly.
the story is more growth inducing perhaps than just like being given an instruction manual.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how am I like Jacob? How am I like Esau?
Yeah.
And these are different voices inside of me. And so it's speaking to something different than this is the true history of these people. It may or may not happen. I don't have any say on the story of Esau and Jacob. But that's not the important point of the story.
Yeah.
Right? It's like what is the truth of the story is conveying.
Yeah. Wow, that's so helpful. I love that.
Yeah.
That's great. Maybe we talk about there are so many things I still want to get to. Maybe we skip to there's this part when there's a page on Uplift's website where you kind of talk about your approach to all of these lessons, and one of them it says that you recognize that you value relationships over the teaching. And I thought that was really important because that is a real tension point, I think, in our communities right now. Like, are you doing harm by like, sacrificing the relationship or by sacrificing the teaching? And like, that's just, it's a hard thing to talk about. And I like that you were very explicit about like, all of this should come together to help your relationships. Like that kind of feels like the litmus test. Whatever the value is, it should produce better relationships.
Yep.
So do you want to just talk about that for a second and maybe address like what it looks like when that's flip-flopped, when you're really prioritizing the lesson over the relationship?
Yeah. So I've been in Sunday school classes where the teacher where somebody brings up something that is really intense emotionally, and then the teacher says, well, we need to get through the rest of the lesson. And they just kind of plow through it. And so that's an example of when it doesn't happen, when it's like, hey, we're all feeling this tension, getting through all the points in the lesson can wait. Like, let's sit and digest what just happened here in the class. And so what we really hope is that somebody who does an Uplift lesson doesn't feel the mentality of having to get through the content. Getting through the content isn't the point at all, right? It's not let's convey this information to our kids and feed it to them. Yeah. It's about having an experience. And so what that looks like is you start into a lesson and you do every lesson has an opening activity and then age-specific sections and then a closing activity, and then we have a section of keep the conversation going. And so let's say that you start with the opening activity and your kid brings up something that is emotionally alive for them or just present for them. And it's actually not even related to the topic of the lesson, but it's what's alive. And so to have that intuitive sense, which honestly I've only developed from doing mindfulness over these past 6 years, the ability to be like, oh, that's where we're going, And so just sensing into the energy of the lesson and being like, okay, let's actually sit with this child and work through it with them.
Yeah.
And we can come back if we want to. We can come back and keep the conversation going on this topic, but the content isn't the point. The relationship and the vitality of what is here is the point.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
That's such a cool way to put it. I remember so long ago, and I brought this up so many times because it really has stayed with me, but I remember Thomas talking about following your energy. And that shift in language really helped me because I think I had for a long time I had really mixed like the spirit and anxiousness in general and just having new words for what I really still do identify as the spirit, as energy. Like that really just kind of like opened up these new avenues, and it made it much easier for me to just recognize that what you're describing, like when the feeling in the room changes and like you said, like you can just feel that that's where we're going now. And I love framing the feeling of the Holy Ghost with that language, that it feels like energy to me that changes. And I wanted to ask you also something that I've really appreciated is that when you address a value on these lessons, that you you pull in these traditions that I'm less familiar with. And I just wondered how you kind of came together and decided to do that, because I do feel like it's been really valuable to read something like The Good Samaritan and then read a story from other traditions that teach that it has the same energy. Like it feels just the same. It's that same feeling of like openness and kindness that feels redemptive. And there really is something just so expansive and powerful about hearing the same feeling described in language that's unfamiliar. But I'd love to hear just like how you all decided that was an important part of Uplift.
Yeah, it's a big part of Lower Lights.
Oh, really?
And yeah, Thomas talks about it as meta lineage, and he did a podcast episode on his podcast Mindfulness Plus that spoke to it just a month ago. And it's about just recognizing that when you really sit with another faith tradition, not in a way to like tell your beliefs and hear their beliefs and kind of part ways, but to really sit with it and take it seriously, like, as human brothers and sisters. Like, I'm going to sit with you and really embody your faith tradition as much as I can. You start to realize more about your own. And you can appreciate aspects of your own as well, even more fully. And so I've also personally, just for whatever reason, had a long-term interest in world religions. The Bhagavad Gita is one favorite. The Tao Te Ching, I try to read once or twice a year. It's very short, very powerful. I highly recommend it to listeners. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is another favorite. And just in noticing the ways that different traditions talk about source or the divine or spirit, whatever I might say, you can really get these different flavors and actually realize like different ways that it can show up in your own life. And there's just power in hearing all the traditions. So a big part of Uplift, this is a large undertaking. It's every step we take in doing this, we realize like, oh, this is bigger than we ever thought, which is that we're creating a wisdom library where we're compiling the wisdom traditions from the best of the wisdom traditions from all different traditions. And so we're interested in collecting them all together in one place and then being able to insert stories, Zen stories, parables of Christ, stories from Native American traditions, and weave them into lessons. So that's a long-term project where we're going to keep adding to the lessons with these stories and having this wisdom library. And then hopefully, I mean, a long-term hope and vision that I've had is to create a book or books that contain these, so that families can say like, oh, here are the values that we hold, and here are these values are replicated in all these different traditions, and you can feel more at home with all of humanity. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that would be such a cool resource. That'd be awesome.
Really.
I do feel like it magnifies what you maybe has just become invisible to you because it's so familiar. I think like we get so used to these stories, and we kind of, it's like we dig deeper and deeper tracks in our own interpretations. We just get used to interpreting a story the same way. And I've noticed that when we hear a story from outside of our tradition, that I can recall times when we address it in our own tradition, but it kind of takes on like a new light. Like we the one we were talking about this week was considering the lilies. Like to me, growing up, that story was always about not fighting. It was like how they grow and toil not, and it was like, that's why we don't argue. But then we were reading the Gita, and there's this really beautiful and explicit passage about you have to disconnect the fruits from your labors. Like you cannot expect the fruits because you labor. Like you have to be, you can work and work, but it has to be for the work's sake. And and I was like, we know, I know that. I know that. But like, I consider the lilies, I think that is also what it means. But I think you kind of lose the ability to see it with fresh eyes. Yeah. And so it's been a really beautiful experience to recognize ways that the traditions sometimes do affirm each other and affirm these values that are important to us.
Yeah. Well, John, we thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been awesome. I thought maybe to close, I mean, we've sort of been like, guiding the discussion so far. But we thought maybe we could open it up to you a little bit and just say, like, is there some story, some concept, something out of Uplift that has been particularly fun for you to learn about and teach about, and that really resonates with you?
One concept that is really live for me right now is a concept called spiritual humanism. And so humanism has taken on a secular idea since like the 1850s. It kind of, secularism became a word, and there was this idea that everything that we need to know could be explained by science. And humanism kind of became synonymous with secular humanism over since that time.
Yeah. Okay.
But there's another aspect called spiritual humanism, another way to view it, and that is that we may belong to a faith tradition or not, but we still have so much in common with people around the world. And an example of this is Fred Rogers, who was a Presbyterian minister, and yet he studied various traditions from around the world, and he wove in humanistic principles to his TV show. It wasn't a TV show that was about converting people to Christianity, but it was about a neighborhood, which is a metaphor that comes from the Christian tradition. And so he was, in my view, a spiritual humanist. Like, when I watch his show, I feel the Spirit. And so he's bringing people to that experience, but not in a dogmatic or a fundamentalist sort of way, but through an expansive way. And so I really take his model seriously, and I really love his model. And so there's this concept of spiritual humanism. Another concept that has really resonated with me lately is from Brian McLaren, who you interviewed on this podcast. His book, Faith After Doubt, is one of the best books I've read recently. And it just, I think about it so much since I've read it. I've read it 3 times now, one with a group that came out of Waters of Mormon Facebook group. And I just really love his model, where he talks about moving from simplicity to complexity to perplexity to harmony. And I see spiritual humanism as a possible synonym for harmony, which is to say, are you a non-believer? We still hold place for you. Are you a believer? We hold place for you. Like, it's not about the divide of what you believe so much as it's about the divide. It's about pursuing this spirituality and deep connection with something bigger than yourself, to be in pursuit of ultimate meaning, and to be able to feel a connection with the all, right?
Yeah.
And so those are some of the concepts that are alive for me. And they're really at the heart of Uplift, which is to say, we are really interested in what stage 4 community looks like, to use Brian McLaren's model. That's, as soon as I read his description toward the end of the book, where he talks about how he hopes that religions can carve off part of their work to help people in stage 4, and do it in a way that transcends any religion. And he also says he says, imagine if religious people and non-religious people could band together, and he uses the word not to participate in the suicidal economy, but to pursue something transcendent. And he says to take the best of the wisdom traditions alongside the best of, and he lists a bunch of scientific traditions. And as soon as I read that, I was like, that is what we're trying to do here with Uplift. And so a simple, succinct way to put it is that it's an attempt at a stage 4 organization. And at a stage 4 organization, I'll say that it becomes more democratic and not dogmatic. And so it's about hey, we have this idea. Oh, you have this idea? Okay, let's see if we can collaborate on this idea. It's not about any single organization winning. It's not the goal here. It's about listening to what's wanting to emerge and being willing to lean into that emergence.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. That really does feel like that's what you're modeling, and it's been really fun for us to be able to sort of participate in our own way.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, and please pass our thanks to your co-founders and everybody that's involved with Uplift. It's really cool.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Jon Ogden. If you're interested in learning more about Uplift Kids, you can go to upliftkids.org. And as always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would really love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, so we appreciate the support. Thanks for listening, and you can check out more at faithmatters.org.